Hi there, everyone. It's really nice to meet those of you who are here and to see the people who are interested in keeping this history alive. I think that's great, and I would like to hear what brought you into this kind of work and how it how it affects other aspects of your life, perhaps. And maybe when we have the Q&A, some of you will tell me about your motivation and your experience. I can imagine the struggle you may have to interpret different people's handwriting, or even in cases where the handwriting is perfectly legible, to try to understand what what the material was about, what was the significance of these notations. And some of them will become clear, and I imagine some may never be known. But I hope you appreciate what an extraordinary opportunity you have to be in that mystery with the people who made those notes in the first place, which is something that I think most people don't even know exists, let alone can participate in the way you are doing. I came to these materials along what you might call several parallel paths. One is an interest in astronomy, which I have had, I could say since childhood, but it'd be more correct to say I had it in childhood, and then I had it reignited when I lived in Ithaca and went to a public lecture that Carl Sagan gave before he was famous. And that was a really formative experience for me. And I'd been interested in science writing before that, but that's what really pushed me to study and write about astronomy. And very shortly after that lecture, and partly because of it, I wound up getting the science writer's job in the Cornell News Bureau. And that allowed me to visit the Arecibo telescope and really have on-the-job training in astronomy, which was thrilling. I I had ties to Harvard, certainly through the Longitude Symposium. Of course, I'd been aware of the university before that, but it was the Longitude Symposium taking place at Harvard that brought me into the collection of historical scientific instruments and and just a sense of the sorts of riches that were available at the university. Also, I had been writing for Harvard Magazine for many years, since about 1975. So that was another connection. And for a while in the 70s, I had a column in the magazine that was about research and discovery. So I interviewed numerous people who had one sort of affiliation or another with Harvard, and that was also very interesting for me. Um, I also wrote for other magazines, which was another route to the to PHaEDRA, because around, I want to say it was 1993 or maybe even earlier, but Omni Magazine assigned me an interview with Wendy Friedman when she was in charge of the Hubble Telescope Key Project to determine the expansion rate of the universe. And she was the first person who mentioned the name Henrietta Leavitt to me. So I always credit Wendy Friedman for giving me the idea for the glass universe, even though it took me about 25 years to follow up on that excellent suggestion of hers. And I don't think the article I wrote about her ever appeared because the magazine was falling apart and ceased publication altogether. But I've kept up with her over the years, and I was recently asked to write an article about Henrietta Leavitt for Sky and Telescope, and I have an advanced copy of the December issue, because as most of you probably know, December will mark the centenary of her death. And they realized they had never run any kind of feature story about her. So that was a challenge to come back to her in a new kind of writing. And of course, I spoke to Wendy Friedman again about that. The experience that I had working in the archives was totally thrilling for me. I don't know, as I said, I would love to hear how you experience the work of handling the materials. But I found it so much like a portal into another time. I was fortunate that the research for this book coincided with a writer-in-residence position I had at Smith College. So I was right nearby. Normally, where I am now at home, I'm a good 6 hours away from Harvard. So it would have been difficult going back and forth as often as I wanted to be there. But from Northampton to Cambridge was on the Peter Pan bus. You know, I could go and go back in a day, because the university archive, which is where I did most of my work, was open only from 11 to 4 p.m. So I could get there before it opened, and then I would have a marathon session in the archives, and then catch the bus and go home. But sometimes I stayed for several days, and then when the archive closed, I could go up to the observatory and look at plates or talk to people up there, and it all contributed. And I will never forget the day I requested the box of Miss Cannon's diaries. And I didn't know what to expect. But sure enough, there were 2 big boxes just full of diaries, including ones she had written in as a very young woman. So it's sometimes it feels a little voyeuristic, to do this kind of research. You're reading other people's mail, reading their diaries, something I would never do in an interpersonal situation. But as a researcher, that's the best kind of material to have. And it's really unfortunate that Miss Leavitt did not keep a diary, did not write many letters, or if she did, they haven't been saved. So, and my research was not limited to the materials at Harvard, although the quantity of material at Harvard was so rich that I realized very early on I was never going to make my way through all of it. And what I'm really referring to are the letter books from the observatory. And I wonder if any of you have ever seen those. So every time a letter went out from the observatory, whatever it was about, a copy was made. Um, and I think I remember how. They would just press a dampened sheet of something like onion skin on the letter, and it would pick up the impression. And if you imagine every time you order a bottle of ink or write to a prospective employee or to the director of another observatory about something, whatever it is, it's in those letter books. And they go back to the mid 19th century. So there's just, okay, from the beginning, I know I'm not going to get through all of these. And then the paper is deteriorating in places. You know, there are holes in the paper. So I had to be selective about that. But then I also had materials to look at the Library of Congress, especially Miss Morey. The Draper family papers are, there's some in New York, but there's quite a bit in Washington. And that was my first experience doing research at the Library of Congress. And I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience, and you may think it's something that you couldn't get, but I just wanted to tell you how accessible it is. And I tell this to students whenever I talk to a school group. All you need to do research in the Library of Congress is to be at least 16 years old and to be interested in something. And that's it. So it's pretty exciting to be there and to just be able to say, I'm interested in the Draper family, you know, show me what you have. So, and there are letters from Henry Draper from when he was a very young man, when he was in the Union Army. It's very, very exciting stuff. And there was also material at Smith College because the astronomy professor at Smith was in fairly regular correspondence with Pickering. And he helped her name was Mary Emma Bird, B-Y-R-D, and he helped her establish the longitude of the Smith College Observatory. Because I was at Smith for a few years, and I couldn't be going back and forth, I just moved into a rented apartment in Northampton. And in addition to Professor Bird, another Smith person who became very important at Harvard was Priscilla Fairfield, later Priscilla Bach, and married to Bart Bach. And she worked for Harlow Shapley, collaborated with him on various things, and there was quite a bit of correspondence between the two of them. And most of her letters were written on Smith College Observatory stationery. But one day she wrote to him from home. And so at the bottom of her note, she put her address. And it was my address. It was the same building where I was living. And I checked the foundation stone on the building, and sure enough, it was old enough to have been her residence. And there were only 10 apartments, but that was close enough. I thought, every now and then, somebody once said of me that I had the appearance of a very rational nonfiction writer, but that somewhere inside there was a mystic yearning to breathe free. And I have to admit to that. At moments like that, I just feel, what is going on here? One thing that did not bring me to to this story or to the observatory was any particular interest in women. That may sound strange considering the nature of the story. I mean, I was interested in these women because of what Wendy Friedman had said about Henrietta Leavitt, about how important her work was, how foundational, how lasting. And then the idea that when Henrietta Leavitt worked at Harvard, she was in a room full of women at Harvard. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Radcliffe students couldn't use the Harvard Library. So it really struck me that this was a most unusual situation. And I think a major reason for the singularity of that situation was the character of Edward Pickering, who was the son of a very intelligent woman, well-educated woman, and the husband of another. He was married to Lizzie Sparks, who was the daughter of Jared Sparks, who had been the president of Harvard. So he was fine around smart women, just didn't bother him at all. And he was very encouraging. He trusted them with a lot of important work. He nominated them for prizes. I think about the only negative thing you can say in his treatment of women is that he didn't pay them enough. But you could say that now about almost any institution. And it's not that he didn't try to make things more fair, because he did. But I had never experienced, personally had never experienced any sort of prejudice, exclusion on the basis of being a girl. Even when I wanted to go to the Bronx High School of Science, it was 1960 or 61 when I took the entrance exam, and we were told that boys would be admitted preferentially over girls in a ratio of 3 or 4 to 1. And of course, in 1960, nobody thought that was odd or unusual. It was just the way things were. But I was accepted, and I never had any teacher make me feel that I had no right to be there or I wasn't smart enough. But now, when I talk to young women who are pursuing particle physics, astronomy at college, they are routinely being told things like that. And I'm horrified by it. But I didn't have a chip on my shoulder. I didn't see this as a women's issue. I saw it as a really interesting story, an unlikely story. But I became revolutionized in the process, because I noticed something in myself that really disturbed me, which was that I kept being surprised by the kind of work the women were doing. And then I had talked to Alyssa Goodman a lot during I don't know who's on this Zoom, but for anyone who doesn't know her, she's professor of astronomy at Harvard. And she was one of the people who agreed to read my manuscript as a technical expert. And when she started reading it, she just was so surprised by the story that she kind of dropped the ball. You know, she wasn't focused on, did I get the astronomy right? She was focused on, good grief, these women were actually doing science. And she couldn't get over it. She said, here I am at this university. I've heard these stories. I'm familiar with all these names, but somehow I always thought it was something cute or quaint. And I didn't realize what they were doing. So that made me much more passionate about the the plight, the the status, the situation of many women in in the professional science field. And I'm not even talking about sexual harassment, which I would be willing to bet never went on in Pickering's harem. We still don't know who came up with that term, what its derivation is, how long ago that happened. It was certainly nothing he would have said, or any of the women who worked for him. Um, so I I feel more strongly about women's issues now, and in fact, my current book project is another women's story, and it's about the the women, and there were many of them, who worked for Marie Curie, which was something about her that I had never heard, and I'd read the latest biography of her. Now I've read all the biographies of her, and really, it's nothing that anybody has ever stressed. So I think it's a really interesting story. And again, she was not a feminist. She was not setting out to hire women. It was just that she became almost instantly recognizable as a famous scientist. And because she was a woman, other women were drawn to her, and she didn't turn them away. So she had about 40 women who spent some period of time in her lab, either as an employee or a student, an assistant, secretary, whatever it was. Um, so, so that's my news story. Um, of course, my book cannot really address a social ill or overturn policy. Uh, my my goal is to tell a good story. That's all I ever expect of myself to do, and I really like doing that. But I did think that by doing this research and telling this story, that I could topple some of the myths that persist around Pickering and the women. And it turns out I can't. I mean, we have a disinformation crisis in this country of gigantic proportions. So the fact that I couldn't kill the old chestnut about my maid could do a better job, I'm going to have to live with that. And I guess it's okay. But I'll keep trying. And I did want to share with you one of the one of Marie Curie's friends was Hertha Ayrton, physicist Hertha Ayrton, and she came to Madame Curie's defense a couple of times because even in her own lifetime, there were many people who believed and spoke out about the fact that she really didn't deserve credit for any of this work, that it was really all her husband's work, and she was just kind of a drudge supporter of what her brilliant husband was doing. So, in answer to some newspaper editorial that espoused that mistaken idea, Hertha Ayrton wrote, I'm going to read this to you: "Errors are notoriously hard to kill. but an error that ascribes to a man what was actually the work of a woman has more lives than a cat. So, so I think that's enough of a presentation time, and maybe we can make this more of a discussion.
Thank you. If we could all give a round of applause to Dava. And now,
Oh, Sarah, great.
if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question or a comment, go ahead.
So, this is more a question about clarification. I didn't fully understand what you were expressing when you're talking about the massive disinformation problem that we face.
Oh, I'm talking about COVID disinformation. I'm talking about the big lie about the election, that kind of disinformation. So that's why I said it's a problem of gigantic proportion, and because disinformation spreads easily now, and people are easily fooled, gullible. So I don't know what to do about it. I find the situation really terrifying.
And in what sense does this reflected in views about the Harvard astronomers?
Oh, that there are certain impressions about them, or there's a very often told, an oft told tale that the reason women started working at Harvard was can be traced to Pickering's dissatisfaction with the sloppy work of his male assistant. And so one day he was dressing down some employee, and he said, "My maid could do a better job." At which point he brought Mrs. Fleming from her position as his domestic servant into the observatory and taught her what to do. And then he hired a lot of other women. And that story, I cannot tell you how many places you will hear that story. And the truth is, there were maybe 6 women already working at Harvard when Pickering arrived. So the notion that women could be computers in the observatory, that's mostly what they did, was well established there, probably because the residence was attached to the observatory. So the director lived on site with his family, and he brought the family in to do work as it was needed. And two of the women working there were the daughters of George Phillips Bond. Another was the wife of one of the not resident, but full-time astronomers. Only the director was resident, and Pickering didn't have any children, and his wife didn't work in the observatory, but she was a hostess of guests and events at the observatory. And certainly Mrs. Fleming had been his domestic servant, but he recognized very quickly that she had taken that job out of desperation because her husband was gone and she was pregnant and really in a bad personal situation, so that she was willing to accept any job. But he taught her how to do astronomical computing. He taught her how to study photographic plates and make discoveries, make judgments from them. So she really did at least the first 10,000 stars of the Draper catalog. And the other aspect of that very popular myth that's wrong is that it it paints Pickering as somebody who would call out an employee in public and embarrass the employee, and he would have been completely incapable of that. I I felt from reading his letters and that chest of 1900. There's a famous document. I think it's even on exhibit in Wolbach Library of Mrs. Fleming's contribution to the chest of 1900. If you can read it online. So this was a time capsule project, and people were asked to really describe their jobs over a period of a couple of months. And Pickering was one of the people also, not just Mrs. Fleming. And his is a very interesting contrast to hers. And he talks about her a little bit and their working relationship, about how sometimes, I'm sorry. Sometimes he asks her to write a letter and then he'll just sign it. But sometimes he writes the letters himself. And he says, that doesn't really save any time because she always rewrites my letters. So it's very amusing to hear his side of their working relationship. But he was so respectful. I love the letters he would send back to cranks. Every observatory director hears from people who have theories of the universe, people who have had communication with extraterrestrials, you name it. This has gone on for centuries at observatories. So he would answer all these people and say something like, thank you for your interesting ideas. I have put your letter on file with the university archivist. And he really did, because it's still there. I mean, his whole crank file is in the university archives. So other evidence of his extreme politeness is the play, The Observatory Pinafore, which was a contemporary work written while Pickering was the director. And in it, he's polite to the point of paralysis almost. I mean, it's hard for him to take sudden action because he doesn't want to offend anybody. And there is one scene where something really awful happens and he curses. But what does he say when he curses? He says, "Oh, Polaris." And it's they make a joke of how polite he is. And so the thought that this person who's caricaturized for politeness would be insulting an employee in front of other employees. It couldn't happen.
We have a question in the chat. I'm going to mute you for a second, because we're getting some feedback. So the question is, I'm surprised by your comment regarding the assumption that sexual harassment in academia is a more recent phenomenon and did not take place in Pickering's office. Could you please expand on your comment and why you think so? Could it be that it was considered more normal back then and now we know how to call a spade a spade? Oh, and now, sorry, you have to unmute.
Okay. I didn't mean to say that it didn't happen at that time. But again, I feel that Pickering's treatment of women precluded that. I'm not saying they didn't have problems with other people. Certainly they would not have recorded it. So as you say, part of the issue is people weren't speaking out. People didn't have the courage to say what had happened to them. But I feel from the attitudes expressed by the women about the treatment they received from Pickering is sufficient evidence that he was not preying on anyone.
Other questions?
So this is more a comment than a question. At the beginning of the presentation, you asked why we became involved in this project. And I can say for myself, one of the reasons is reading your books.
Oh,
Many years
nice.
ago, I read Galileo's Daughter. I think I've read all your books since then. And it definitely spurred my own personal interest in the history of science.
I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I wonder, I know you talk about how gender can influence like the treatment of these women and the perceptions that persist. I was wondering though, if you look at how race and also like socioeconomic status played into their acceptance and ability to participate in the first place.
Well, certainly there was racism there because all of the women were white. And I think some of the personal correspondence, even from Miss Cannon, who seemed to love everybody, just showed the culture she'd grown up in, where she did not expect, what did she call the term she would have used? Probably she would have used the term Negro. That there was a difference, possibly even an innate difference in terms of fitness for a certain kind of work. So that's embarrassing. It's worse than embarrassing. It's what our culture has fostered. The relationships that developed with the people on site in Arequipa were really positive. There were local people who became trained, who really ran the observatory, the day-to-day operations, who were befriended by Solon Bailey and his wife, and other people from Harvard who worked there, and probably Miss Cannon, because she actually got to go down there and observe from Arequipa. But no, on that score, I think the observatory was as blinded. They were more open-minded when it came to women, but I don't think they were open-minded about race at all. Socioeconomic, yeah, some of these women, and probably some of the men who worked there, had came from poorer backgrounds. I don't. You certainly didn't have to have been a Harvard student to be involved at the observatory. It was a wholly disowned subsidiary. They had to raise their own money. They really, at least in Pickering's time, they really didn't get a lot of top-down direction from the Harvard Board of, is it the Board of Governors, the Board of, I forget what they call the administration, really, at Harvard. But Pickering was in charge, and he was often putting his own salary back into the observatory operations.
We have a question in the chat. Eric asks, you said that you were interested in telling a good story. In science, we also often try to turn a discovery into a good story when we write papers. At the same time, a lot of misinformation is spread because it conforms to the stories people are already telling themselves. How do you balance the search for the right storyline with fidelity to the information you want to convey to the reader?
In 25 words or less, yeah. I think scientists are so often put on the spot in interviews or in challenges to present their work, if I'm understanding your question correctly, that perhaps you feel boxed into a certain perspective. And the material is complex. It requires interpretation. Who is your audience? Who is the audience for the story? I guess that's the thing that is key in telling a story. And I do not think about the general public because it's too vague and daunting an idea. So when I'm writing a book, I will try to pick a particular person I'm telling the story to, because that answers a lot of questions about how much do I have to explain. Does the person know what an atom is? And I think there's only so far you can talk something down. There's going to be, even as a reporter, if I interview someone to write about their research, for sure I'm not going to get it right on the first attempt. So that's why even now I always go back to the source. I always say, would you read this over and make sure that the science is right? Or if it's a book about people who lived long ago, then to pull together a committee of experts who will each read this or that part and provide guidance. But if you're your own storyteller, it may be difficult to envision the level of plausible reception in the audience. Alan Alda, who is very interested in science and for years was the host of Scientific American Frontiers, he started to work with young scientists just to help them tell their stories and give them tips, tools for making complex material more understandable. And a lot of it involved workshops in theatrical improvisation. And there are some videos online about this project he started, and there is now, I think, at Stony Brook University, an Alan Alda Center for Science Information. It has a name like that. And you can see these scientists in the morning trying to give a brief explanation of what they do. And then they go through the day's activities. And then at the end of the day, they try again. And it's a lot better. So I don't know if that might be of interest to you. I just want to know if any of this has answered your question. Not talking.
He said yes. Yes.
Okay, good.
I had a question, Dava. You mentioned that Wendy Friedman, in conversation with her, was sort of the seed for the Glass Universe. Do you find that for your other books, they came out of conversations with people, or was it something you read? Like with the new Marie Curie book, how did you come across that she hired women?
Sorry, it's rarely from a conversation. That was unusual. in February, right around the time, February or March of last year, when right around the time the pandemic started, I was asked to review a new book about women in chemistry. It has a wonderful title, Women in Their Element. And that book came to me because of the Glass Universe. And it was a collection of vignettes about women chemists, maybe 35 essays by many different authors, an edited compilation of all these profiles. And as I read them, I was so struck by the number of women who had either studied under or worked for Marie Curie. And I have to, just as the number went up, I just thought, how come I don't know about that? And I had never heard of probably 33 of the 35 women in this book, many of whom had done really interesting, important work, including discovering a new element. And Marie Curie herself was just one of the vignettes in the book. So that got me thinking, has anybody addressed this? And there is a book in French that has a title something like The Women Who Worked for Marie Curie. And that too is a series of vignettes of all of these women, but they're very disconnected. And this one is all by a single author. And she is a curator at the Curie Museum in Paris. So she has all these records, and she was very interested in the fact that there were so many women. And of course, Madame Curie's own daughter, who went on to be the second woman to win a Nobel Prize in Science. So, so I'm in touch with that author, and but my book is more of a story, and it's really Madame Curie's story, but bringing in all these women instead of just keeping the focus tightly fixed on her.
And we have another question about stories. Rick asks, what percentage of your stories would you consider factual? Or put another way, how much poetic license do you allow in your writing?
I try to allow zero license for making things up. And because I'm writing a story, and because I have a style as a writer, I think sometimes things might sound novelistic, but really aren't. I think the one time I was accused of making something up was it's a moment in Galileo's Daughter when the cardinals are meeting to elect a new pope, and I said that Maffeo Barberini, who was the person elected pope, that he was sweating in the Sistine Chapel. And somebody actually wrote to me to say, how do you know he was sweating? Well, it was July in Rome, and we have about 50 people in a very small room. And part of the process is if the votes aren't decisive, the ballots have to be burned in the wood stove that is in the room. And I think it would be impossible for any human being not to sweat under those circumstances. So I stand by my assumption that he was sweating. But that's the only thing that really came up as a point. I try very hard to not make it up, but any storyteller will shape the story. What do you leave out is as important as what you put in. If you put in everything, it becomes unreadable. I mean, you can't. So you're making decisions all along the way that shape the story, but I would hope do not turn it into fiction. That is not my goal. I have no talent for fiction. I want to be perfectly open about that. And I said that to an editor once who replied, that never stopped anybody else. But I'm not going there. I find the research part so engrossing, it's fun, really. I will admit it has not been fun trying to learn radioactivity. That has been extremely difficult. But if it were easy, I don't know, wouldn't be as challenging.
We have time for maybe one more question.
We should have some quiz show music. Or does anybody else want to talk about why you came to this type of work? And
Hi, David.
Hi.
Help preserve the history.
Great.
I think I've mentioned that to you once before.
Yes.
And also,
And thank you for doing it.
one gets a chance to visit Boston. I was really taken by visiting the stacks and actually seeing where history was made, as well as the library and seeing Cecilia's thesis shelf.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess we'll call it there. I want to thank Dava Sobel again for coming to our virtual office hour. Next month, we have George Johnson, the writer of Miss Leavitt's Stars, coming. And if everyone could give Dava a virtual round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's been really fun. And I'd like to come next time and hear George. So do you think I could be invited?
Definitely.
Okay. I've certainly read his book several times.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye.